from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Julie Fine, I'm Joe Matthew. Tonight, a softer touch. President Trump acknowledging his administration could use a different approach on immigration enforcement the same day that 700 federal agents are pulled from Minneapolis. The impact this could have on a possible Homeland Security shutdown now just 9 days away. We'll talk with Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who's standing by live.
Plus, Bessent in the hot seat. Fireworks on Capitol Hill as the Treasury Secretary faces lawmakers demanding answers on fiscal policy, Kevin Warsh, and Fed independence.
Let the record show that he refuses to answer a question. No, we're not going to do that with me. We are not going to do that with me.
And we'll talk to one of the lawmakers who was in the room asking questions.
And be very worried. President Trump delivering a stark ultimatum to Iran ahead of high-stakes nuclear talks. What happens if the talks fail? We'll ask Evelyn Farkas at the McCain Institute coming up. Just some of the stories we're following today in Washington as lawmakers prepare to leave town. Some already have after passing legislation to end a brief partial government shutdown. The goal of reaching a deal on new restrictions for ICE agents in the next 9 days appears a bit aggressive, with Democrats and Republicans far apart on several critical issues, even with the administration's plan to withdraw roughly a third of ICE agents now deployed in Minneapolis. Joining us now with the latest, Washington, is Bloomberg White House correspondent Jeff Mason. Jeff, it's great to have you with us, and welcome to the table here on Balance of Power. The softer touch that we heard about from Donald Trump today appears to be a direct reaction to some of the polls that we've seen following these two fatal shootings. Will he stay on this side of history?
Well, let's be clear. Like, softer touch does not a policy change make.
Yeah,
this is a policy that the president ran on when he was running for office in 2024. It's a key issue for his voters. But yeah, his polls are going down, and his polls are going down with independents, who his party is going to need for the midterm elections later this year. So he's reacting to that for sure. But I think the proof will be in the pudding in terms of whether there's an actual policy change and not just a change in tone.
Well, he said in an interview that when it comes to Minneapolis, a softer touch might be needed. But he also said, but you still have to be tough. So certainly trying to thread the needle here.
For sure. And again, like, threading that needle and not saying I want to change the outcome. I don't want to change what I want. Other than I think he genuinely doesn't want to see deaths of more U.S. citizens on the streets from ICE agents. And yet it's his policies that led to those things, and it's the implementation of those policies that led to the outrage that has come from what happened in Minnesota.
So how deeply involved will he get in negotiating potential restrictions around ICE? This is happening as we speak, as we just mentioned. We've got 9 days to figure this out before either another continuing resolution needs to be passed or Homeland Security doesn't have any funding. That could impact the TSA. That could impact FEMA. Will the president be on the phone to drive this?
That's a good question. I mean, he may be, and he's done some direct calls with lawmakers before when these types of crises have come up. He obviously didn't want to have another full-on government shutdown, or they wouldn't have partialed out these two bits of funding in the first place. So I think that alone was quite interesting. But if it's not him making the calls, then his people will.
It was the president, though, that got some Republicans who were saying we're not going to vote for this. He got them to vote for it. This time around, though, stakes are much higher, only because you have to get the DHS funding passed, and you're looking at things like demasking, which are certainly not popular with some of his Republicans.
Indeed. A couple things, though. DHS does already have a bunch of funding, even if this doesn't go through. ICE, I think, is funded through the big, beautiful bill. That doesn't mean this isn't important. It certainly is, to get funding for the rest of the department. But to your question, yes, there are some unpopular things with Republicans that Democrats are asking for, and one of them is that these people don't wear masks, and that's something that so far they've not wanted to give up.
The demasking is one component, body cameras are another. And we saw Kristi Noem announce just a couple of days ago that these, in fact, would be deployed to Minneapolis and eventually nationally. I think she said funding permitting, which is interesting because they have a lot of money to spend on body cameras right now. When you start getting into the use of warrants, for instance, tighter restrictions on the use of warrantless raids, or some of the other ideas that we've seen, including new training, could any of these end up in a negotiation, or are they all non-starters for the Republican-led Senate?
Well, I think they can certainly end up in a negotiation. It's hard for me to say whether or not they will end up in a deal.
Yeah,
but
right.
I think the Democrats certainly feel like they have a lot of political power right now on this issue because of the polling that we were talking about earlier and because of the outrage that has ensued from what happened in Minneapolis. So they're going to shoot for the moon in terms of what they want.
Mm-hmm.
I would have to imagine neither side at this point wants any type of shutdown prolonged because of the midterm elections.
I think that's true. Shutdowns, somebody gets blame for a shutdown. But in a year with a very important election coming up, you're rolling the dice as to who gets the blame. And I think both sides don't want it to go long, and they don't want the same kind of shutdown that we saw last year.
Boy, interesting. You know, I'd noticed that there was no travel outside of Washington for an affordability speech this week.
By President Trump?
Yes, that was the drive by Susie Wiles, right? Who's going to be on the road every week beating the drum on affordability. Instead, he's issuing threats to Iran today. Is this noteworthy?
Well, it's noteworthy in that they did want this year and they did want the months leading up to
He's
the
still
midterm
obsessing
elections.
over geopolitics.
Yeah, and he's not going to stop that. And no president would stop doing foreign policy. That's part of the gig. But there is a political reality for him that people care about their pocketbooks when they head to the polls. Mm-hmm. And it's only February. The midterm elections are several months away, but that's not that long in politics, and it's not,
to say the least.
And it's in a year where, so far, the polling has shown his party could be in trouble.
Jeff Mason, so good to have you at the table. Thanks so much for being here with us. And another huge day for corporate earnings and an important after-hours session with results from Alphabet, Qualcomm, and ARM, and their stocks are moving in extended trades. For the details, let's turn now to a special edition of Power Moves with Bloomberg Tech co-host Caroline Hyde, who joins us from World Headquarters in New York. Hi, Caroline.
Hi, it's great to see you both. And what an extraordinary session we're having after hours, where we see chip designers, the chip makers in the line of fire, but Alphabet's vertical integration just powering through. And I'm going to start with the winner, as it's currently up 1.6%. Alphabet, parent of Google, is spending wildly. It is increasing its capital expenditure more than 100% for the fiscal 2026 year, up to $185 billion. But it can vindicate that expenditure. And why? Because the whole vertical integration flywheel effect is coming into clarity. We're seeing them processing extraordinary amount of what they call tokens. Basically, the usage of their models are going up and to the right, but they're able to keep their margins still strong because they use their own TPUs, their own chips, along with some NVIDIA ones as well. But most of their cloud customers are coming to them for their own TPUs. That makes them far more cost efficient. Their cloud growth, phenomenal. 48% for the fiscal quarter just delivered, much higher than had been anticipated. And so the investors cheer that sort of capital expenditure. You're also seeing people using YouTube more. You're seeing people subscribe to Gemini as an app. 750 million people are doing that per month. You're rivaling OpenAI with about its 800 million users per week. So clearly they are running neck and neck when it comes to the Gemini 3 prowess, which is also getting to the sphere of gaming that they talk about. There is so much to be developed here as well, because you also might have a Google phone in your pocket. That's another way in which you're using their generative AI. You may be using AI mode on the internet. You might be using search that much more to dig into the AI overviews that they give you. Overall, Sundar Pichai is saying it's working. Now, what isn't working? Let's move over to some of the stocks that are in the red at the moment, because not everything around AI is up and to the right in the moment. We've been questioning some of these names, and after the delivery of ARM in particular, once again, even though they managed to show real growth in excess of 20% in terms of revenue and indeed profit still delivering, it wasn't as much as the market had hoped. I think highest expectations weren't quite delivered on. We're seeing ARM down some 7.3%. Remember, it's largely held by SoftBank, but this is a chip designer that gets its money from licenses, from royalties. And I'm also looking at Qualcomm under pressure as memory and the cost of memory is impacting demand for their smartphones, the chips that go into their smartphones, Joe.
Can't wait to see what happens in tomorrow's market after people have a chance to sleep on this. Caroline, thank you for a great readout here. Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde live in New York with the stocks moving before our eyes. You can catch Caroline's interview tomorrow with the CEO of Qualcomm, Bloomberg Tech, 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time.
And let's go now to Capitol Hill. Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas joins us live. He's chair of the Senate Commerce and Transportation Committee, and he also serves on both the Senate Foreign Relations and Senate Judiciary Committees. Thanks so much for being with us, Senator.
Julie, Joe, good to be with you.
I want to begin with an interview that President Trump just had on NBC News regarding ICE enforcement. He said when it comes to Minneapolis, maybe a softer touch is needed, although he says you still need to be tough. What do you think is the right approach right now?
Well, listen, what we're seeing in Minneapolis is tragic. We're seeing angry left-wing protesters who are deliberately confronting law enforcement, are getting violent with law enforcement, are obstructing the efforts of law enforcement to arrest violent criminal illegal aliens. And unfortunately, we're also seeing the consequences of the overheated rhetoric that we've seen from so many Democrats. As you know, 2 Americans were shot in interactions with law enforcement. Anytime an American is shot in interaction with a law enforcement, it's tragedy. But it is a tragedy that is being compounded and being encouraged by Democrats who are using language referring to ICE agents as Nazis, referring to them as murderers in a way that is wildly irresponsible, wildly reckless. They are encouraging violence against law enforcement. And I wish everyone would just ratchet down the rhetoric and focus on, look, it was not very long ago that there was enormous common ground that violent criminals should be arrested and taken off the street. And sadly, Minneapolis is now a clash over that basic proposition.
Senator, though, do you think it's time for ICE to make some changes after what we have seen?
Listen, I think ICE is doing a heroic job. I think they're doing an incredibly difficult job. And I think the confrontations are being egged on by left-wing protesters who are engaging in violence. They're following strategies of how to deliberately obstruct ICE when they're coming in to arrest a murderer, when they're coming in to arrest a child molester or a rapist. These left-wing agitators, it's not an accident that this is happening in Minneapolis, the same place that we saw several years ago the Black Lives Matter and Antifa riots begin, where we saw the looting and the burning that happened. There is serious money from the extreme left that is funding these radicals, and this violence is unacceptable. In my view, violence is always, always, always wrong, and I think this confrontation, it reflects just how extreme today's Democrat Party has gotten. I think the American people, I think people in Texas want to see violent criminals arrested, and yet over and over again, Democrats are siding with the criminals over law-abiding citizens.
Well, I just want to ask you about the debate that's underway with regard to Homeland Security then, Senator. And I hear the position you're coming from, so I'm guessing that a lot of these are non-starters for you. We talked to your colleague John Cornyn yesterday. He said the request to demask ICE agents was insulting to their professionalism. Is that something that you would consider if it meant funding Homeland Security and bringing down the temperature?
No, because the reason that ICE agents are having to wear masks is because the left is deliberately doxing them. They are targeting them. If they find out their identities, they are sending violent protesters to their homes. They are threatening their families. And by the way, you have Democrat politicians calling on these law enforcement officers to be doxxed. Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of Democrats in the House, stood up and said, go and unmask them and identify them and go after them. That is wildly reckless. You know, I was in Dallas several months ago when one deranged leftist opened fire trying to kill ICE agents with a rifle because he had listened to the anti-ICE rhetoric from the radical left. This is dangerous, and this is violent. And listen, these law enforcement officers are just trying to protect their families and protect their kids from the violence being fomented by the extreme left.
Well, I just wonder what you think of the president's comment then, Senator. What does he mean by softer touch?
Well, I think it's exactly what I just said, which is ratcheting down the rhetoric. I think that's important for us to try to take some of the anger. You know, it is an unhealthy dynamic in our country that the two sides are filled with so much rage and just yell at each other. We need to be able to talk to each other and try to find some modicum of common ground. That hadn't happened in a long time, unfortunately.
Senator, though, when you say ratcheting down the rhetoric, are you saying that you believe it's all Democrats that have brought on this problem? I mean, aren't both sides somewhat to blame, do you think?
Look, I've encouraged everyone to ratchet down the rhetoric. And for example, the two shootings that happened, anytime you have an officer involved shooting, there's an investigation. That's standard practice, that is a natural step to occur. That should occur here. And I think anyone who jumped to conclusions about what happened, we should wait and see the evidence. You saw Democrats go on TV and scream that ICE agents are murderers and they're just shooting people for no reason. That is wildly reckless, and there should be an investigation. That happens. That happens as a matter of course. I'll also note one thing that the DHS Secretary Kristi Noem did that I very much agree with is she announced that they're going to be putting body cameras on ICE agents. I think that is a very positive development. Yes, yeah. I don't think body cameras are the friends of the extreme left Democrats and the irresponsible claims they're making. And I think the body cameras, they protect citizens when you're interacting with law enforcement, but they protect law enforcement. And so I think that's a very positive development.
Senator, I'd like to ask you about an important hearing that you held today with regard to autonomous driving and a piece of legislation that you're pursuing to do away with the patchwork of rules on the state level and actually come up with a national framework. We heard from Mauricio Pena, an executive at Waymo, the Alphabet-owned autonomous driving company. Here's what we heard.
In over 100 million miles, our data shows that we are 10 times less likely to be involved in a serious injury collision as compared to human drivers in the cities where we operate. And data also shows that we're 12 times less likely to be involved in a pedestrian injury collision in the cities where we operate. So I think we're making a difference already.
Were you compelled by the presentations today from Waymo and from Tesla, Senator? And would you get into a self-driving car tonight?
I absolutely would get in a self-driving car, and I got to say, there are very few policy areas where we can have as dramatic and direct an impact saving lives as dealing with autonomous vehicles. You know, every year about 40,000 Americans are killed in car crashes, and 94% of those come from human error. They come from drunk drivers or distracted drivers. You get people texting and driving. You get people, their kids are yelling them in the back, and all sorts of things. People falling asleep because they're really tired. And autonomous vehicles, we are seeing that they are dramatically improving safety. On top of that, there's a whole other element of keeping our kids safe. Look, unfortunately, you know, all of us who are parents who have teenagers or young adults, you know, sometimes kids go out and do something stupid. Sometimes they have a few too many drinks, and sometimes kids foolishly get behind the wheel, and it can be the last decision they ever make. I think AVs provide a real source of safety to keep our kids safe, to keep our grandkids safe. And I got to say, one of the things I talked about also at the hearing today, I'm a father, and Julie, as you know, of 2 teenage girls. Heidi and I will not let our girls come home in an Uber because I don't trust a strange man alone in a car with our teenage girls. In my city of Houston, 4 Uber drivers were just indicted for sexually assaulting teenage girls in their cars. I got to say, as a dad, I would really be grateful to be able to have an autonomous vehicle take my girls home when they need a ride without any danger of an assault. So there are lots of steps. And by the way, on top of that, we heard a lot of testimony of the benefits of AVs for people with disability, whether the visually impaired or people with paralysis or using wheelchairs. Or people who are elderly and lack the ability to drive anymore, to drive safely. Autonomous vehicles has the potential for a whole wide category of Americans to really substantially improve their lives.
Senator, I just have to ask you quickly, I'm getting the hook here, but can you tell us about the Rotor Act following the collision outside of DCA? We understand that you've received a promise to get a vote on the House floor. Before we say goodnight, is that going to happen?
I believe it's going to happen. House leadership has been unequivocal in committing to putting the Rotor Act on the floor. I think the House is going to pass it. This is bipartisan legislation I authored to improve safety for the flying public. The NTSB just put out their report about the horrific crash that happened over DCA Airport last year, and they concluded if the Rotor Act had been the law, that crash would have been avoided and those 67 souls would still be with us. We can do this. This would make the flying public much, much safer. It's already passed the Senate unanimously, and I believe the House will take it up and President Trump will sign it.
Let us know when you get a timeline on that, Senator. Thank you for joining us. Ted Cruz, the Republican from Texas, live on Bloomberg. Coming up in the hot seat, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's testimony before the House Financial Services Committee. It got chippy, and we'll speak to one of the lawmakers in the room next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I want to read you a quote. Trump will pursue a weak dollar policy rather than implementing tariffs. Tariffs are inflationary and would strengthen the dollar. Do you recognize that quote?
I believe you're referring to a letter that I wrote, and
yes.
Tariffs could be inflationary.
No, it says tariffs are inflationary. You said tariffs are inflationary. Do you want to correct what you said to the ranking member, or did you lie?
If I was mistaken, I want to correct it. And I was also mistaken when I said that tariffs could be inflationary.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Julie Fine, I'm Joe Matthew. That was Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois pressuring the Treasury Secretary today during Scott Bessent's appearance before the House Financial Services Committee. Congressman Casten joins us live now from Capitol Hill. That seemed to be a productive exchange, Congressman, because we've heard this a number of times when we go back in time to go back through what Scott Bessent has said about inflation. Was that a revelatory moment for you?
I mean, it was a revelatory moment to me in the sense that I learned a long time ago that if you raise the costs of something, the price goes up. It was, that wasn't really my primary line of questioning, but we had raised that because he directly lied to Ranking Member Waters at the start of the hearing, and we had the document. And frankly, what he said before he was Treasury Secretary is nothing particularly revelatory, right? If you add tariffs, they're inflationary. It's shameful that once you work in the Trump White House, you have to parrot the line even if it conflicts with everything that you know to be true.
Wow. Well, it sounds like you agree with Gregory Meeks, who said today, stop covering the president, stop being his flunky. Scott Bessent, Donald Trump's flunky?
I don't know where his spine is. I don't know where his character is. I think he's smart enough. He's had a successful life. Presumably, he understands how markets work. And if you read what he wrote in January of 24, what he actually said was that he wanted the United States to pursue a weak dollar policy and that raising tariffs would be contrary to that. Well, he's now the Treasury Secretary with tariffs and a weak dollar. And he claimed that the weak dollar would spur manufacturing, but in fact, manufacturing starts are down. And, if you're in that job and you have, the custodial responsibility of huge parts of the economy, get your damn facts right. Don't just lie about them.
Congressman, I'm curious what you think of the implications are of Treasury Secretary Bessent saying today the president can interfere with the decision-making of the Federal Reserve.
Look, it is problematic on a whole lot of levels. And this is less about Bessent and even to some degree less about Trump. We are so fortunate as a country to have an independent Fed. We are so fortunate as a country to be the world's reserve currency. And as you've had these attacks on Fed independence, it's not unrelated that during that same period, we've seen a collapse of the dollar. We've seen a lot of people who are now hedging their dollar investments in U.S. equities. These are not the kind of things that maintains the kind of good economic fortune we've had over the last 75 years. And, prior to this administration, I think everybody understood that if independent Fed was good, you shouldn't get involved in that. We can have differences of opinion, but you need them to be independent. And so it's more problematic that the Treasury Secretary wouldn't just instinctively understand that, or even worse, does understand it and feels that he can't say what he knows to be true because he's just trying to please the president.
Well, so do you have Tom Tillis's back on this idea of blocking confirmation hearings for Kevin Warsh until Jay Powell's investigation is resolved one way or another when it comes to the Department of Justice? What happens with the next chair in the confirmation process?
Well, look, I think that's ultimately going to be a question for the Senate of how they run through there. I would hope that my Senate colleagues look at some of the people they've confirmed and some of the consequences for that and take a little tighter degree of scrutiny than they did a year ago. But I'm on the House. That's not going to be my question. I will say I think Chair Powell has done an exceptional job. I think this country would be well served if he stayed in the job. I think the concern from a lot of people about Warsh is that he has not had the kind of commitment to preserving the independence of the Fed that you'd like to have in that role, especially when you have the President of the United States saying he wants 1% interest rates. Fine, we can all want that, but you really want a Fed chair who's going to stand up and be independent to that. But we'll see how the Senate plays that out.
I want to turn now to the shutdown that's been avoided, at least for now. What is your absolute when it comes to ICE and DHS funding to get your vote?
So what I've been very clear on is that for me to support ICE funding, they need to be held to the same standards we hold to law enforcement, which is to say no masks. You have to identify yourself. You have to have a judicial warrant before you go in and start terrorizing citizens. There has to be accountability so that if you do violate people's constitutional rights, you can be held to account. That shouldn't be a high lift. I have also been very clear that we need to claw back the $75 billion in additional funding for ICE that makes them the second largest branch of government after Department of Defense. It is very clear that they have too much money, too many staff, and not enough leadership. And for fiscal responsibility reasons, we should take that money away. But also, if we're really going to hold them to account, Congress has the power of the purse. And if I don't get all those things, I'm not supporting a DHS funding package. In spite of the fact that, we have to have FEMA, right? We have to have TSA. I think there's no reason why we couldn't parse those things out and fund them as separate packages. And I know a number of us are trying to see if we can persuade Speaker Johnson or others to do that. But I can't sit there in good conscience and say that you have an arm of the federal government murdering U.S. citizens, and we're going to do nothing to hold them to account.
Well, it may not surprise you that we just had a very different conversation with Senator Ted Cruz about this, Congressman. He echoed the comments from his Texas colleague, John Cornyn, in that demasking agents is a non-starter in these negotiations. Can we assume then Homeland Security shuts down in 9 days?
I'm sorry that Ted Cruz hates the Constitution, is all I can say about that. I think that if reasonable voices are present and prevail, we can avoid a shutdown. I think the practical reality is that when you have the leadership of the Republican Party saying that we think the Fourth Amendment is a bureaucratic nuisance, and the leadership of the Democratic Party saying we want to treat these people with the same kind of responsibility we give to law enforcement who we respect, there's no overlap in that Venn diagram right now. I'm hopeful that we can avoid a temporary shutdown or find our way through, but it's hard to see right now how we're going to square that circle.
Congressman, I'm curious, with two very different sides right here, have any discussions even begin? Is there a group talking about how they can come to some sort of a compromise on this?
I can tell you that among the rank and file where I live, there's a lot of discussion. I think a lot of this is really going to come down to where are the points of leverage that happens, with Leader Thune, Speaker Johnson, and Leader Jeffries and Schumer. I think the part that I think all of us really struggle with is it's very clear that the president would like to de-escalate the situation with ICE a little bit and hope that the public won't care as much about this, because right now they have a real political problem. So there still are just as many troops in Minnesota, but they've moved them to the suburbs where there are fewer cameras. I think the thing that none of us want to happen, but probably gets to a solution, is if there's another horrific ICE shooting that keeps it in the news. And my real request to everybody who cares about making sure that you don't have to wonder whether a law enforcement officer with a mask on is looking out for your interests, the best thing that you can do right now is just to continue to be vigilant, to monitor what they're doing, to shoot those videos out, keep these atrocities in the news, because that's the way that we make sure that we get back to some standard of basic constitutionality and decency and safety.
Democratic Congressman Casten of Illinois, thanks so much for being with us today. And earlier today, the Trump administration hosted officials from around 50 countries for a summit on critical minerals as the U.S. pursues an agreement designed to reduce dependence on China. Vice President J.D. Vance earlier today spoke at that event. Take a listen.
Today, the international market for critical minerals is failing. Consistent investment is nearly impossible, and it will stay that way so long as prices are erratic and unpredictable.
Joining us now with all the details here in our Washington bureau are Bloomberg's Mike Shepard and Bloomberg's Eric Martin. They both attended the event today. Thanks so much for being with us. Mike, I want to start with you. Can you break down exactly what happened today? I know there were some agreements.
There were some agreements. The whole idea was to bring in all these ministers from the U.S. trading orbit to try to get some agreement on a way to create some stability in pricing as a step toward reducing reliance on China. And the U.S. actually inked agreements to keep talking with the European Union and Mexico and Japan. And the idea is that within the next few months, they would have something more in place when it comes to establishing some price stability. The administration took pains not to use the word price floor, but that really is the idea. And that is something that the industry has been pushing as a way to keep Chinese competitors from undercutting anybody who arises in countries like the U.S. or elsewhere that might try to enter a space that China has long dominated in both extraction and refining of these minerals.
Interesting that we've got the EU and Mexico involved here, both of which the president has at times been at odds with. Certainly the EU right now when it comes to trade. Eric, does this tell us that the long view on countering China is more important to European nations, for instance, than the trade drama that's underway right now?
Well, certainly it's a long-term challenge that faces all Western nations. The fact that 90% plus of the refined critical minerals come from China currently, that the vast majority of smartphones are made in China. All of these issues are things that countries are dealing with in common. And it was interesting that they tiptoed around, at least in the public part of the event that we saw, the public part of the summit, tiptoed around mentioning China by name. But Secretary Rubio in his press conference said, we all know that there's one country that controls everything. I mean, it was really kind of the elephant in the room, or not in the room, because you had 55 countries present, many of whom have China as one of their, if not their top trade partner, and yet China, of course, is not there.
You know, when you talk about the elephant in the room, obviously some skepticism from everything that's come out of this.
Well, of course, there is a lot of ground to cover still when it comes to putting into fine print everything that was discussed today, not just with the European Union and Japan and Mexico, but also with all the other trading partners that were present today in Washington. And in particular, Joe, as you alluded, there are still so many trade disputes right now between the European Union and the U.S., and not to mention tensions with Mexico. We're waiting now to see how the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement will be reworked and rediscussed and renegotiated, especially in light of all of the trade disputes and conflicts, both north and south. We've seen the president go after Canada, but also go after Mexico as well on trade and other security questions.
So is this another framework of a plan or a concept of a plan, or will this be codified?
Well, this is something that past administrations have also targeted, including the first Trump administration, in terms of looking to source critical minerals from friendly allied nations. But this also helps explain part of the national security strategy we've seen from the Trump administration, with the corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and the focus on Greenland, on Venezuela, on Argentina, on Chile, a lot of places in this hemisphere that the U.S. is looking to boost investment and to use equity, not just loans, but equity now from places like the International Development Finance Corporation to invest and to have the U.S. strengthen these supply chains closer to home so that the U.S. is not put in a position like it was last October, where China announced these export controls and suddenly there was an emergency and a crisis situation.
Well, fascinating stuff here. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard and Eric Martin, great reporting, and thanks for bringing it to us on Balance of Power. In an upcoming exclusive interview with NBC's Tom Llamas, President Trump heeds this warning for Iran's supreme leader. Take a listen.
I would say he should be very worried, yeah, he should be. As you know, they're negotiating with us.
I know they are, but the protesters have said, you know, where are the Americans? You promised them we would have their back. Do we still have their back?
Well, we've had their back, and look, that country's a mess right now because of us. We went in, we wiped out their nuclear.
So that's the question. If we wipe them out,
we have peace in the Middle East.
Yeah.
If I didn't take out their nuclear, think of it. If we didn't take out that nuclear, we wouldn't have peace in the Middle East because the Arab countries could have never done that. They were very, very afraid of Iran. They're not afraid of Iran anymore.
Joining us now with insights into all of this, Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director at the McCain Institute, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia and Ukraine in the Obama administration. Evelyn, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining. The president said it clearly. Iran should be very worried. Do you take him at his word?
Well, look, the fact, Joe, that he has a carrier, you know, which, as we know, he tends to use his carriers when he has them stationed off the coast of countries, as we know with Venezuela, because it's a large asset. And when you leave it there at great expense, not just expense, you know, monetarily, but also the expense of readiness, you know, they're there and there's the cycle, the military cycle is impacted, training cycle. So I would say that he probably does intend to use them, to use force somehow.
So is there any hope for these talks that are supposed to happen later this week about, you know, coming to some sort of an agreement?
Well, if the Iranians are sufficiently worried, which again, I think they should be, there is some hope for talk because I don't think they want to, you know, have Trump bomb them. And of course, we don't know exactly what President Trump would do. And frankly, anything he would do wouldn't really be something that would bring about an immediate change to the regime. But obviously, it would make them look weak, even weaker than they are already. I'm just not sure whether the end result would be Iran capitulating. But I do think that they are likely to want to talk.
What do you make of the venue change on Friday, now to Oman, and the request that this be handled just between the United States and Tehran on nuclear only? Is that encouraging? How do you read this move?
Well, I think that's frankly our Middle Eastern allies saying, you know, we don't want to get involved in dictating regime change. We don't want a messy situation in Iran as much as they don't like or trust the Iranian, you know, theocracy, the Ayatollahs and of course the security forces. They don't really want chaos in Iran either. They don't want it bleeding over into their countries. They don't want Iran taking revenge. And of course, U.S. bases are positioned on their territory. So I think they're trying to contain any kind of fallout that might impact them. And then, of course, you know, narrowing it to the nuclear also would potentially mean that the regime itself is not threatened. All of that chaos could be avoided. And they're only dealing with the big existential threat being posed towards Israel and the rest of us.
Can we talk? I'd like to turn a little bit to what's happening now in Ukraine. You saw the president asking President Putin not to bomb. That didn't happen this past week. Where does this stand now, and what do you see in the next few weeks here?
I mean, Julie, I don't see any change, really, frankly, since the last time the three parties met, because Vladimir Putin continues to demonstrate that he has no interest in compromising and he has no interest in bringing the war to an end. Whether, you know, he was supposed to stop firing on innocent civilians in Kyiv and taking out their electricity under freezing conditions, you know, on Sunday or Monday or Tuesday, it doesn't matter. You know, he's clearly showing that he's not a good faith negotiator, because normally what you would do is cease fire and then have a serious negotiation. So that's not happening.
Well, the president put a different shine on it when he was asked about this yesterday at the White House. Evelyn, listen to Donald Trump on this agreement that he had announced for 1 week. Putin would not be bombing energy infrastructure and killing civilians in Ukraine. Here's what he said.
He kept his word on that. It's a lot. You know, 1 week is, we'll take anything because it's really, really cold over there. But it was on Sunday, and he went from Sunday to Sunday.
Are you disappointed he didn't go further or go?
Yeah, I would like him to. I want him to end the war. I spoke to him. I want him to end the war.
The president also said it was nice of Vladimir Putin to give this a week. Evelyn, how are we supposed to read this moment that we're in, and why would we indulge Russia with another meeting?
No, I mean, look, of course we want Russia to give the Ukrainians any day of heat and ceasefire and life that they can. But I mean, it's outrageous. You know, what Russia's doing is a violation of international law every day. And this is on top of everything else that they have done, all the kidnapping of children, the rape, the torture, etc. So I think the president is giving them a huge pass. And what President Trump should be doing is saying that this is unacceptable, that we're going to put pressure on Russia, that he's going to take Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, the senators, sanctions package. He's going to sign it into law. He's going to, ramp up the good interdiction that we've already seen in the Trump administration of these ghost tankers so that Russia gets less revenue coming in. And frankly, I hope that he adds to the agenda that he has with President Xi coming up soon when they have their summit, that I hope he adds to that agenda, that China should stop providing technology, dual-use technology to Russia and supporting Russia's war.
You just got to my next question. President Trump and President Xi, of course, having that wide-ranging phone call today. What's your reaction to that? What do you think? You just pointed out some of it. What's the best case scenario that can come from that?
Well, the best case scenario is obviously that they continue to keep the language, diplomatic, because I think there's no reason we shouldn't, applaud the fact that President Trump is not threatening China or ramping up in an escalatory verbal fashion, because he's actually still doing some really important things like providing the biggest defense package to Taiwan in years. And of course, standing up to China on tariffs and other issues. Having said that, he still can do more. As I said, he could put pressure on Russia, and there are other things that he can seek to get from China. Also, of course, many of us would not like to see the United States continue selling advanced chips to China. But again, all of those things might be things that could change after they have a conversation. And I'm hoping that the president can be diplomatic but firm about what the United States expects when it comes to Russia and all of these issues, frankly.
Evelyn, thank you. Evelyn Farkas, Executive Director at the McCain Institute. It's good to have you back on Bloomberg. Coming up, the Supreme Court clearing California to use the new voting map in this year's midterm elections. We'll bring you details next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Julie Fine. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Thanks for joining us. We'll have a lot more on today's top stories when we assemble our political panel next. First, the stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. The Supreme Court giving California the green light to use its new congressional map, which favors Democrats in this year's midterm election. The map was originally drawn to counter Texas's Republican revamped map, which created 5 new GOP-leaning congressional seats in the state, but new polling suggests Republicans may not sweep all 5 of those newly created districts.
Bitcoin has tumbled to its lowest level since President Trump took office, and prediction markets now suggest the cryptocurrency may have further to fall. Bitcoin is down 40% from its all-time high back in October. Contracts on Polymarket, a decentralized prediction platform, now imply an 82% chance Bitcoin drops to $65,000 sometime this year. Crypto market sentiment has been shaky since early October, when a surprise weekend crash liquidated billions of dollars in various positions. A fresh sell-off this past weekend has only darkened the mood further.
The Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, announced a sweeping round of layoffs today as part of a push to cut costs, including the elimination of its sports and book sections, along with reductions among foreign correspondents, some of them fired while they were in the field. While the Post did not specify how many jobs are being eliminated, Bloomberg previously reported the Post was preparing to cut as many as 300 positions. The layoffs, reportedly impacting 30% of the newsroom, marks the latest in a series of staff cuts and buyouts in recent years as the Post navigates financial pressure and internal scrutiny over its direction. Joining us now with their reaction to this evening's political panel, Republican strategist Lester Munson is with us, principal of the international practice at BGR Group, alongside Democratic strategist Janae Wartell, partner at ARC Initiatives. Janae, Lester, great to have you both here, and thanks for joining us. What was that line about democracy dies in darkness?
It does indeed.
It's getting a little bit later on, light later on at night.
Yeah, it's getting a little bit of light later on at night. Listen, this is, I think many people predicted that this would happen, you know, with the recent shift with the Washington Post, and there was a lot of editorial concern over the direction. I think we're now seeing that impact its bottom line. And so it's really an unfortunate direction for this to take, but I think many people could have predicted this.
Signs of what's to come? We're looking at changes at CBS News.
Look, I did a scientific survey of Washington Post readers, and if there's no sports section, there's no reason to read the paper.
That's where you started, right?
Yeah, that was the best part of that newspaper. They back when Thomas Boswell was writing for them, it was the best sports section in the country, maybe except for a paper in Boston.
Chicago boy talking.
Yeah, and
Boston?
This is a tragedy at a human level that there's no sports section.
Isn't that something? Well, look, this is obviously a difficult time for the news business in many ways, and when you hear a story like that, you do wonder about what it means for the stories that go uncovered. You know, it's been a long time ago that the local news departments cleared out the courthouses and the police departments and people reading police blotter. What is the impact on the social discourse?
Well, I think we're going to be more reliant on social media, which is terrible. Newspapers have played a huge role in our politics and our public life for a long time. I think it's a critical element. I think they've got to have a revival here. I think the Post kind of misplayed things over the last few years by kind of herky and jerky going this way and that way. They need to get back to the news and to reporting, leave the opining for the op-ed page, focus on delivering what's actually going on in the world and come back.
Is it a bad look for Jeff Bezos to have just dropped, I think it was $40 million on the Melania documentary?
Well, Jeff Bezos' kind of popularity in the court of public opinion is certainly hurting his businesses. And so I think it's no secret here that, you know, he doesn't do himself any favors there. But I think to the point about social media, I think that's right. A lot of our news is now going to be in sound bites. It's now going to be in reels. And a lot of this long form content that gave context to what was happening is going to be gone. And that's really concerning.
Thank God for Bloomberg.
Is it That's right, Joe. But is it a response, essentially, to people can find the news that they want, they can pick and choose it? So when you see something happen to the Washington Post, which is central to the life here, what goes through your mind?
Yeah, but that doesn't really create a real community, right? Like we're Washingtonians, or we're Northern Virginians, or we're Marylanders, or we're part of the DMV. We need to have kind of that place where we can all go and read the news and find that common ground. You can't really do that in social media if you're just picking and choosing the things that you think are of interest to you or that agree with your perspective. Much better to have that kind of civically responsible newspaper that's part of the public life that we can all relate to.
Boy, everyone's agreeing on this here. My heart is exploding.
We're going to go into their media silos, and that's not
right.
Great.
No, it's not great, actually. Silos of any kind, and there may be some silos being installed at the Federal Reserve. The president was asked today in an interview with NBC News about his criteria for hiring the Fed, knowing that he's, of course, criticized Jay Powell for not cutting interest rates, and there is a perception that he expects the next Fed chair, Kevin Warsh, to do the same. Listen to this.
Let's get to the Fed. Is there any doubt in your mind that interest rates are going to be lowered?
Not much.
Why? How can you say that?
I just think they're going to be lowered. I mean, they should.
Is your new Fed pick on board with that?
We're way high. Okay, we're way high in interest. We have now, with me and with all the money, I've always been good at money. And with all the money coming into our country, we're a rich country again. We have debt, but we also have growth. And the growth will soon make the debt look very small.
He said, if he said he wouldn't have gotten the job, would he have gotten the job? He said no. This man is expected to cut rates. Is that the way this works?
You know, Jay Powell cut rates significantly. So, and the economy is in fact booming. The growth rate in our GDP is significant, and it is strong, and inflation is under control. It's hard not to think that Powell didn't do a fantastic job. I'm not sure how Warsh can improve on that.
But Warsh has to now go into this knowing that the president said he basically got the job because he said he would lower interest rates. That is not an easy way to begin your new job.
100%. Like he's continuing this precedent of this now being an incredibly highly political job. And the point of a Fed chair is supposed to be to protect the neutrality of that job, of that role of the Federal Reserve. And now this is someone who's handpicked by the president, and he's going to feel all of these pressures to just comply outside of what is economically sound principle.
What are you hearing from your contacts in the Senate about this? Tom Tillis says no hearing, right, until the Jay Powell investigation is resolved. Is that going to magically resolve soon?
I suspect it will. Yeah. You know, the Senate is becoming maybe incrementally, but a little more assertive in its relationship with the White House. They kind of see that the popularity numbers are not where they could be, and they may have had some concerns about recent events. So I think they're going to be willing to be a little more assertive here, particularly Republicans with this president, mostly behind the scenes. But they're going to be willing to kind of do a little bit more steering, kind of from where they sit on Capitol Hill. Mm-hmm.
So you think you will see a break from message? Can you see it on the Democratic side as well?
I think the Democrats have a real rallying message now, what's happening with kind of this obstructionist culture in Congress and with the Senate. And Republicans haven't gotten much done, right? They control all three chambers, and yet we are not seeing prices go down. We are not seeing the way of life being made better for everyday Americans. So Democrats on the campaign trail have a rallying cry, which is Republicans have not made everyday life better for Americans. Where I think you're going to see Republicans breaking a little bit from the talking points of the Trump administration is they're in a lot of very vulnerable districts that are going to be razor thin margins. And so they've got to be thinking about what is going to make sense for my district. Is our cost lower for people in my district? Is health care a concern? And how can I speak to that on the campaign trail? Otherwise, they're going to be in big trouble.
You know, President Trump was supposed to be traveling every week, Susie Wiles said, to talk about
the affordability tour.
There's no speech on the schedule for
Didn't we have Infrastructure Week
every
week during the first term?
Is this
it sounds vaguely
week?
Familiar.
Okay.
Yeah.
Boy, that was the Republican strategist saying that. Check in with us on the next speech.
Lester Munson and Janae Wortel, thank you so much for being with us.
Check out the Washington Edition newsletter. You can find it on the terminal and online. And thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. Alongside Julie Fine, I'm Joe Matthew. This is Bloomberg.